Appreciate your question. I don't see how that would be a problem. Any art form, in whatever capacity, secrets as such really wouldn't have any kind of social relevance. So unless I'm misinterpreting you, I'm going to have to move on to other things because I'm running out of time. But I agree with you. As an art form, I don't see why the art of magic as an art form, just like the art of dance, would change at all, depending on how the culture, transmutates its values. So, number 17. This is a three-part question. I'm going to go very quickly. I remember you saying a while back that there would be a future weapons piece in Zeitgeist moving forward regarding the military. This subject was glanced over in the military section of the movie, Why So Did You Run Out of Time? The answer is yes. I did actually intend to do something on the advancement of technology and how it's used, and I was going to use this Bill Hicks clip as well. But, there's only so many things I can put in the documentary, and it's long enough as it is. So it's a good subject, and maybe I will do something in the future, which leads to the next section of your question. What do you say to the idea of calling the next film Zeitgeist Moving Forward Part 2, having the meat of the film elaborate on the transition from society today to a resource-based economy? Going back to my other issue, the transition isn't something that I think would occupy, say, a major film like this, because it's too ambiguous. I can't define it in a way that could make it have the integrity of such that people could walk away with it thinking that what was advocated is the actual path. I'd rather stick with what I know. Third part of this question. Many critics poke fun at the resource-based economy by stating that all economies are resource-based. What do you think about a name change to a resource-managed economy? I think that's cute, but in the end, people will semantically interpret things however they want, and we're just dealing with a label overall that deals with a data set and an approach. As far as all economies being resource-based, that's actually not technically true. They obviously use resources, and there is an association through price efficiency. Even barter, you could say, is based on resources, because obviously scarcity can come into play and change people's value for barter, but that's a very loose distinction and says absolutely nothing about the technical significance of how resources should be utilized in the most efficient way, which is, again, one of the central flaws of the free market system. A true economy is a strategic manifestation of the usage, distribution, and allocation of resources in whatever the context is, based on the scientific referent, not based on the whims of who has the most money. Okay, number 18. Peter, once the first city is built, not the research center city, are we allowed to enter the city as soon as it is built, or are there some sort of barricade test educational system put forth to enter the city? This would answer common questions such as, what if I wanted my house built from gold, or what if I wanted to have 10 children each? Okay, well, first of all, the city isn't the same as a resource-based economy. To answer that question, you really have to think about the evolution of the idea. And by the time the idea comes to fruition, people understand what the city mechanisms are. They understand what it means to be sustainable. They've shed a certain amount, and hopefully all of their materialistic values that have been culminated from this culture. The need for excessive things, the very invention of $5,000 handbags that really have no actual worth at all in any technical sense other than the brand name. These are all the things that you would hope would have been shed. So no one would want a gold-plated toilet seat because they would think of that as completely offensive, as people logically should in a finite planet. If you have any caring about your fellow man whatsoever, or your family, or your friends, you don't behave that way because it's unsustainable. So the quick answer to your question is no, because by the time such a thing comes to fruition, you already have to have a population that basically understands the idea. Number 19. With respect to your new film, do you think the models of the Venus Project presented to people are great in terms of efficiency, but not so good for human demand and the things people are interested in, even if some things that people are into are a bit erroneous? I see what you're asking. So it's not aesthetically appeasing to them based on the culture that they're from. Yeah, you're going to have that conflict, and I'm not sure what to say about that. As far as Zeitgeist 4, as you bring up, it's going to be different. I really can't comment, but I do understand the relationship you're talking about, and finding a way to bridge or get people to appreciate the aesthetic of utility in the sense as presented by the Venus Project is important. I also really think that Jacques' designs personally are quite beautiful. They actually are very artistic. They're very representative of the individual's interest, which is what Jacques' idea is about. You see, Jacques is actually very custom in his concepts and how he sees the future unfolding, where you don't just have a house that's just strictly utility for the sake of blind utility. It's still utility, but there's variations of how that utility can be oriented in certain contexts. And if you hear him speak, he'll say how people's homes will reflect them and their interests. And it's a very important point, but I don't have time to go on all of that. Second part of your question. You said, quote, there is no experiment to Stefan Molyneux. Can you elaborate on why a preliminary test city is not the way forward compared to a global approach? I think I stated something very much in passing with a direct relationship to what he was talking about. And I probably spoke haphazardly because I was a little agitated that day. There is no experiment in the sense that I was responding to the kind of cynical notion that this is just like some idea as was presented by Stefan, as though this is, oh, let's just have an experiment just for fun, as though it could never be implemented. As you know, he spoke of talking to Hal and begging for your bowl of porridge, if I remember correctly, a very condescending description that he gave. So my reaction was more of a reaction to the gesture that I saw. But yes, the preliminary test city is important. But really, the testing attribute doesn't change the global approach. The testing attribute doesn't change the need for this system and its underlying tenets of sustainability and direct physical referent for decision making and full accountability of our resources and updating society to present day knowledge. So there is no experiment from that standpoint. This isn't some crude idea that we're going to put in motion and suddenly everything the Zeitgeist movement and the Venus Project advocates falls flat. That's simply not going to happen. The issue of social sustainability is not an opinion. Okay, next question. Number 20, I have a question. Could you clarify the resource-based economy's relationship to its inhabitants and their ability to make life choices? A lot of people seem to automatically assume that everyone will have to have the most efficient clothing and so on, and that there is no choice of preference. Very good question and a very large question. The question is, why would someone not want to have the most, quote, efficient clothing, or the most comfortable clothing, or the most operantly sustainable clothing, or the most long-lasting clothing, or the most efficient car? Is it really a question of efficiency? Why would someone prefer to not have something efficient? That's sort of like saying you'd want to go buy a car with only 3 wheels just because you want the option to do so? Is that why you do it? No, I'm extending that a little bit into an absurdity, but I understand what you're saying. As far as people making life choices, what I'd like to say with those that bring that up, to those that bring that up, is say, what choices do you have now? What choices are we talking about? The ability to walk into a mall and, depending on your purchasing power, to buy basically clothes that will break down very, very rapidly because they're made very, very poorly. I remember going to New York and going to these places like H&M was one, and it was the worst clothes. It was the cheap, and and they relatively comfortable, and it was cheap, which is why I went there. But my God, I don't have any of that stuff anymore because it was so cheap. It wore away, it diminished, and why would I want to go and buy something like that? If you have a society oriented towards maximum sustainability and efficiency, I don't see how anyone could justify not wanting that as an option. And let me ask you this. Do you have the option to have the most efficient clothing in the current society? No, you don't. You don't even have the option, regardless of your price structure, to get the most efficient, meaning the most scientifically advanced. We don't have the option in the current world society to get the most advanced, safest automobile. We don't have the option for that because of the very inherent nature of the system. So keep that in mind when you kind of talk about issues of freedom, of choice, and things like that, choice of preference. If you think hard enough about it, you will notice that you really have very limited choices in the current environment, even though the market system pretends like you have infinite choices. What you see around you that looks like all of this choice is very, very limited to a select few that have the ability to have the purchasing power to engage those choices. So, you can go into a supermarket to pick between 75 different kinds of sugared cereal, but what if someone wanted to make cereal that was actually optimized for human health, that was customized from human health? You're not going to have that in the current culture. People just don't think that way. I read a study recently, and I want to find it, in fact, that described how the human life could be extended much farther than what we think of today as normality because of the crude nature of what we take in health-wise and our lack of understanding of the human organism, or at least the lack of application of what we could do to optimize our health to extend our lives substantially. So, excuse my tangent, but life choices have to be aligned to something, and they can't just be whimsical and arbitrary. And coming out of the current environment, we have all sorts of flagrant choices that really shouldn't even exist and that are in fact detrimental. So I'm going to have to leave it at that because I'm running out of time. But suffice it to say that there's plenty of choice, but the choices are indeed limited to those things that could be considered sustainable and of optimized concern, whatever the context may be. So there's your limitation of choice. And if you just think about that for a second, you see that, in fact, there's probably going to be a lot more choices, especially when the economic structure is in place that doesn't have the external restriction properties and enables an access abundance. I think people will have tremendous choices, far beyond what they see today overall. But in a good way, not just flagrant choices for the sake of perpetuating the market system, etc. Okay, number 21. Hi, Peter. One thing I don't have an answer for is how we will get from privately owned factories, production facilities, technical equipment, etc., to state ownership. For example, if a given country decides it wants to implement a resource-based economy, how will this country obtain ownership by means of production so that the teams can use them and move forward with the implementation plan? Will it be through legislation or some other method? Well, I think to answer your question, first of all, a resource-based economy is really a global system. Anyone that implements a resource-based economy regionally, well, it would have to be completely self-contained, which I think is very difficult to do in the modern world. If we resorted back to an extremely low energy kind of hunter-gatherer feel, if you will, sure, which again is what they actually had back then, was a resource-based economy. But we live in a new paradigm with a very large population, and we need industrial methods. Hence, we need a global management system to maximize the usage of the resources required, and all the other things that we talk about. No, the actual question of how the factories and how the property, if you will, of others comes into the manifold of the entire system, I think it's simply because people begin to realize the merit of it. It's the educational process. No one with guns goes around and takes your stuff. There's no violence. If people don't want to do it, then they don't do it, okay? But I think once the pattern emerges, once certain people are willing to do so, once big amalgams of mining corporations say, we understand this and we think it will be to our benefit to let this go in motion. Once they understand that it isn't a state as well, by the way, that terminology is incorrect. It isn't state ownership. It isn't even a sense of communal ownership in that abstraction. You can get rid of that notion. It's a social organization. It's a social organization of society for the betterment of everyone in society, and everyone is in control of it. And the beauty of technology today, which didn't exist a long time before in what they call centrally planned economies, is that you can create an interface where everyone can interact. And they have to interact with the scientific system, though. It's not an election of individuals where some elite emerges and they sit around a table to decide who gets what. There's no forms to fill out. It's set up so everyone has access and everyone participates through the method of science. It isn't some whimsical democracy where everyone votes on something. Those are all archaic ideas. We arrive at things through physical references from the ground up, the scientific method, based on the demand generated by the needs of the people and the interests of the people. But it's still scientific. Even if those interests are completely artistic and aesthetic, you still use a scientific approach to make them come into culmination. So that's a bit of a long-winded explanation. How do we get there? I think the collapse will influence people, and I think people will begin through education to see the merit of the system and how it will not only be better for them but for everyone else in society to move forward. And that's how you do it, through mass consensus. Number 22, a two-part question. Do you agree that a transition has already begun the moment the Zeitgeist movement was created, at least when we talk about shifting value systems? I could say that, yes. I think the transition has been happening a long time with the general awakening of people realizing, well, almost a revisiting to the awakening